Okay, I have pushed the go live button. That usually means that we've gone live, but you never know for sure with computers, which is kind of the theme of today's discussion. So let's see how it goes. Shout if you can't see us. That probably won't work, but Laura, who's monitoring in the background, will definitely tell us. And I see 7 eyeballs, so that means at least 7 people are out there in the ether somewhere listening to me and John. So so that you know if you've come to the right place, I'm Squirrel. This is the Squirrel Squadron weekly live stream event. And we have a wonderful guest, John Topper, who I've known now, John, for at least 10 years, I think.
I would say so,
I brought
yeah.
you in that long ago. Commando Development says hi. Very nice to see you. Please do say hello. Let us know where you're coming from. And in particular, why did you come? So what's the most interesting to you? As those of you who've been to these before know, the very best thing you can do is ask lots of questions. So throw those in the chat on whatever platform you're using. Both John and I would love to answer questions. You probably have better topics than we do. And so if we just talk to each other, we'll just have a wonderful catch-up after, as I say, 10 years of on and off working together, find out what's happening with the Scale Factory. But much better if we answer your questions on unleashing chaos. Let me say just a little bit more by way of getting started. The Squirrel Squadron, if you don't know what that is, that's my group of tech and non-tech people getting together to learn as much as possible. We have a forum, we have these regular events, and I'm as interested as anybody in getting tech and non-tech people cooperating together. Lots of groups for DevOps people, lots of groups for sysadmins, lots of groups for founders, lots of groups for CFOs. I don't know any that brings them together the way we do. So if that's interesting to you, you can find out more. I'll ask Laura to throw in the Squirrel Squadron link for us in the chat so that people know where to go. If you have to drop off or anything, there'll be a recording. Some of you may be watching this on the recording. Hello to you as well. That'll always be available on the forum and on the same links that you came to here. If you're interested in further events that might be fascinating to you, we're going to be talking about hurrying up and doing nothing, and why doing nothing is sometimes the best thing an executive can do. That's in a few weeks. We're doing tech strategy next week on how to make your tech team insanely profitable. I'm going to be in Vienna in 3 weeks, Miami in 5, and in London in person in early December. So lots going on, lots of opportunities to do fun things. I'm just going to throw in there we go. That's the Squirrel Squadron link. And John, of course, we'll give you a chance to jump in and say things about the Scale Factory. Would you mind introducing yourself and saying what amazing stuff you're doing these days? I know what you used to do, but I'm not sure I know everything you do now.
Sure, yeah. So I'm John. I'm founder and CEO of the Scale Factory. We've been in business since 2009, which is I guess why we've known each other for so long. We primarily these days work with SaaS businesses delivering their product on AWS, and we concentrate on all the things kind of infrastructure that support that. A lot of the work that we do tends to be with...
Now, not everyone in this audience will know what those acronyms mean. So SaaS is software as a service.
So software as a service, yeah. So people who are selling software as a service, typically internet-delivered applications that are billed for on some kind of usage basis, I guess is probably the best way of looking at that. VCs, venture capitalists love SaaS because it's a subscription model, and so predictable future revenues, which always good for valuations, although post-pandemic slightly less good for valuations than it was during the pandemic, and everyone's feeling the pain of that at the moment. But we tend to work with those sorts of businesses that are kind of A and B round stage startup SaaS, where maybe they don't have people on their team to do things with their Amazon Web Services platform. They don't have the sort of level of expertise that we have. Often we're coming in to help solve some of the technical debt that was quite rightly accrued during the race to minimum viable product, and then setting them up for success in the future. That means removing risk, typically to do with security, availability, compliance, speed of delivery, that sort of thing. So we tend to get involved at that early stage, set businesses up for success, and then sort of see them off into their hyper growth stage, I guess, with that thing sort of taken care of. So obviously things like thinking about backups and disaster recovery and chaos and everything is something that we do quite a lot of at that sort of stage.
We're going to get into that a lot.
Yeah, alongside that, I'm an AWS ambassador, which means that I'm one of the people that AWS have recognized for my contributions to the community, and the main community contribution that I have really is that I co-organize and host the AWS User Group UK meetup, which was online during the pandemic a couple of years, and that's now back in live again. The next one of those is in fact next Wednesday, aligned with I think it's the DXC event at Excel. I currently test positive for COVID, so I don't know whether I'm going to be there. If I'm not testing negative in time for that, then I won't be. But if I make it there, I'll maybe see some of you there.
That would be wonderful, and thank you for being with us in spite of COVID. My dog is obviously very excited about your event, so don't get off of here. Don't let us let you leave without letting everybody know where they can come and listen to you as well. Yeah. Because any chance you get to hear John talk about system admin is a chance well taken. So absolutely do that. I was just checking on audio. There's just a little bit of crackle, but
okay,
I
think that's
maybe
okay.
me. So,
I can change this setting.
Okay, let's see if it works. Live adjustment on the fly.
Exactly. Yeah, I turned off automatically changing my microphone volume because this mic is generally pretty good, but I've now turned that back on. So hopefully that's better for everybody.
That does sound a little bit better. But if you have any trouble with audio, do say so. People are telling us it seems okay, which is good news. Fantastic. So, John, when we first started talking about this topic, when I was thinking about, gee, I really got to get John on, you said, everybody's way too optimistic. What did you mean by that? And why might some of our viewers here be overly optimistic? Why would that cause them a problem?
Okay, so I guess first off, there is no might. All of you are way too optimistic, and that is a common human bias. We are typically wired for optimism, even those of us who come across kind of miserable and pessimistic, as I am occasionally want to do. We are still actually biased towards over optimism. We tend to assume that negative consequences will befall other people and positive consequences will befall ourselves, and that sort of thinking, I think, tends to leak into the way that we prioritize how we work when we're building systems and platforms, and often that means not adequately giving consideration to the various ways in which things can fail, and ultimately that means that we have to recognize that this is a bias that we have, and we need to lean into that recognition by intentionally making space to think pessimistically around the things that we're building, and make sure that we're taking into account the things that might cause us trouble in the future, which we might otherwise be inclined to ignore.
Fantastic. I'm muting for the dog, so apologies if I talk like this. That's my failure to unmute. But John, what strikes me is that when I'm coaching people and executives in how to perform better, one of the things I have to do is often kind of undermine their biases. I have to help them to think really differently. And I often have to do that in quite a radical way. I have to tell them, you have to change your self-talk. You have to change your processes to force yourself to do something different. And one of my favorite examples, it's one of those few times when I read something, I said, my God, this is going to change how I think, was when I heard about what Netflix does to force themselves to think this more pessimistic way. What could you tell us about that? And also, what's your opinion of it? Do you use it? How does that work for you? The chaos monkey approach.
Yeah, so the chaos monkey approach is the kind of sexy version of this, if anything that we do is at all sexy. Like it's the thing that people go to and think of when they are thinking about this sort of failure modeling. And for those of you unfamiliar with what this means, Netflix have a suite of tools that I think that they've released as open source tooling called the Chaos Suite, and they are all named after, I think, or the Simian Army maybe. They're all named after different types of simian: Chaos Monkey, Chaos Gorilla, Chaos Kong, etc. And these are tools to intentionally introduce chaos into an Amazon Web Services environment, randomly shutting things down. I think Chaos Monkey does things like introduce latency to individual servers and that sort of thing. Chaos Kong, I think, takes the entire region out of play and makes sure that their sort of failover mechanisms are working. And this is really
clear,
appealing.
They're doing this in production, so they're doing this with real users,
absolutely.
with real people who are actually downloading movies and watching them.
Yep, all in real life, live environments, and I think that the reason why the reason that this is appealing, I think, is to those of us who are in tech. We quite like tools, right? We like to be able to run something or try something, and we're particularly enamored with the idea of running things built by people like Netflix, because that makes us feel like we're a little bit more like Netflix than we probably are. And realistically, what's going to happen if that's the first thing that you do when you're chaos engineering is to go and deploy the chaos suites to your infrastructure in live, is you're going to take it all down and cause pain, gnashing of teeth, wailing and suffering to your users. So really you've got to dial this back a little further than that before you go anywhere near the tooling. These tools are great for testing hypotheses, right? You come up with a hypothesis that says, my platform is really resilient against X, Y, and Z type of chaos. Let's go and find out whether that's true. And there is no point conducting that type of experiment unless you've made some attempt to mitigate for that type of chaos in your design or in your architecture or in your software. So put aside all thoughts of enlisting the Simian army for yourself until such time as you've gone back and done the paperwork exercise that is, look at what you've got, think about the ways in which it can fail, and basically tabletop roleplay this stuff instead. So one technique that is recommended by, I think, Daniel Kahneman, who, if you've read Thinking Fast and Slow, which I know that you have, Squirrel, he sort of looked at some of this stuff, and I can't remember whether it's him that's suggesting it or whether I heard him talk about it as attributed to somebody else. But the idea is that instead of thinking about how things could go wrong, you put yourself in a frame of mind where things have already gone wrong, and you are thinking as though you are looking back at the failure to figure out what was the cause of it and how did that go on. They call it a pre-mortem. And that mental reframing tends to kind of remove that bias of optimism, because actually you're not thinking about how could things go wrong, you're thinking about how did things go wrong. And there's a bunch of useful ways in which you can do that. One of the things that we do when we're helping teams with this is to work through you start with a diagram of their infrastructure as a starting point. You just work through all the components and say, well, what would happen if this was starved of resources? What would happen if this fell over? How could this go wrong? Like, just looking at all the failure modes for each of those things, and then enumerating a list of either actions that you can take to mitigate against that thing, or questions that you need to answer in order to better understand the failure modes of that system. And they'll go on your backlog, and you maybe prioritize them to some percentage of your sprints over the coming sort of months, and eventually you get to a better understanding of and better resolution approach for those things that help you write run books. They'll help you maybe change your software. For example, one sort of classic thing, many of you might have worked with MySQL in the past. Popular database for some value of popular, certainly popular to dislike. But MySQL has a plethora of exit codes or rather error codes coming back from trying to make a query. And not all of those exit codes or error codes mean that didn't work, go away. There's a stack of them that relate to, you just hit a deadlock, you can try your query again. So if you're writing software that uses MySQL, going to look at how your error codes are handled for your database helps you get a better understanding of whether or not your database handling is kind of intelligent enough to retry that sort of failure. What happens, for example, if you're on AWS RDS, which is the managed database service, if that fails over into another region, the domain name that you're using, the host name that you're using to get at your database endpoint actually changes IP address behind the scenes. What happens if that happens? Like, does your application re-resolve that name frequently enough? How often? Like, does it fail to actually re-resolve anything because it's disobeying the DNS RFCs? All those kind of things are questions that come out of those conversations that you have in looking at each of those potential failure modes and thinking about how your app's going to work.
Fantastic. Okay, so John, we will have lost some of the listeners. That's fine. Others will have really followed all that. But if you're trying to sort through all the acronyms and so on, don't worry about that. What John is doing is illustrating a pre-mortem for you. So what you do is you get your engineers together and you say, what happens if that one fails? What happens if that one fails? What happens if this goes to that but doesn't do that, and then it doesn't update the other thing? And they try to think, if all those things had happened, what would be going on? Rather than trying to think pessimistically, they think, what would be the thing that we would be having the post-mortem about? if it had failed. And that mindset is really helpful. I just assigned a person in a very different part of the organization, not in system admin at all, to do a pre-mortem for software delivery. She was trying to think, what will I be saying in December about how we didn't get this software done in the time we expected it to be? And then, of course, what can I do about it now in October so that doesn't happen? So this is a tremendously useful technique across the board. And you don't have to turn on a whole bunch of monkeys in order to do it. So if you're thinking...
But turning on a bunch of monkeys is the last thing you should be doing, really.
That's just going to take down your service, as John describes. This is tremendously useful. John, I'm wondering, how do you use this in working with your customers, with the people who are doing AWS setups with you? I know you have a very standard setup. So have you already thought this all through? Do you go and do pre-mortems with them? How do you do it?
Yeah, so we do things slightly less in less of a standard way than we used to when you and I were engaged together. We used to have a very opinionated set of deployment on that platform that would answer a lot of the design questions that people would have for AWS. And today that's a bit less true because the platform is so broad and people's needs of it are so broad that the things we do are a lot more bespoke now. So it typically we're engaging with teams at the point at which they've built something. Even if that something has just been sufficient to get to their MVP, to convince someone to give them money to help them build the next version of it, essentially. And so there's a few things that we do. We use a thing called the well-architected framework, which is an AWS and Amazon provided set of good practice to follow when you're building platforms, and reliability is one of the pillars of that framework. So we tend to start with customers reviewing their infrastructure against the framework and highlighting risks that they have from a design perspective based on what we can see they describe their infrastructure as being. And that's a very high level thing. You're kind of assessing whether or not the team that you're speaking with is thinking in terms of how do we run our platform in multiple availability zones or in multiple regions for availability. We're also typically asking questions at that point about the extent to which teams are determining what their objectives are as far as reliability is concerned. So things like the recovery point objective and the recovery time objective, maybe an SLA.
What do those mean, John? What's a recovery time objective?
So let's go and define those. So if you have a data service that you are writing your important data to, you probably have two objectives that you need to bear in mind. There's the recovery time objective, which is the amount of time in which you would like that data source to be available again should it become unavailable, and the recovery point objective, which is how much data are you prepared to lose in the event of that outage. So if you're using something like DynamoDB with AWS, those can be quite short, both the time and the point objectives. If you're using something a little bit more custom built, then those things might be longer. But the key thing isn't to make both of those numbers as small as possible. The key thing is to make a business design choice about what is the correct amount of investment to make in the recovery time and point objectives. Unless you are choosing those objectives, you can't really plan a disaster recovery plan or a backup strategy that's going to reliably hit the business needs that you have. And those,
can I try an example? John, could I just try a couple examples just to illustrate for people? So one's the company that we worked on together, where John came and helped me do a ton of scalability work, and that was an e-commerce company. We cared an awful lot about being up, and we didn't care at all about our data. If we lost some, even if we didn't deliver to some customers, we had high volume. So it was unfortunate. We didn't want to lose any customers, but if somebody didn't get their cheap handbag, we were okay. We'd sell more cheap handbags. So we didn't care that much about a recovery point objective. That could be a while ago, but we wanted to be back up in seconds. So that would have mattered to us. The company I went to after that provided a debit card for kids, for 8-year-olds, so they could learn about money. So we really cared about making sure that we didn't double charge somebody that would confuse the kid and anger the parents. So and our regulator wouldn't like us very much. So recovery point objective would have been important for us there. But time, actually, if it was down for a bit, that was unfortunate. Some kids might not be able to buy their toys or McDonald's, but we'd much rather that we kept their money. So that might be, have I got that right? Is that a good contrast?
Yep. Yeah, that's a good contrast. These things are trade-offs, and I think the other thing to think about is that those RTO and RPO, those objectives, might apply differently to different services in your infrastructure. So your general ledger, for example, as a banking platform, you absolutely are completely right. You don't want to lose any data, but if things are down, that's okay as long as they're not inconsistent. But there might be other parts of your platform that need to be up all the time, but could
the marketing website would have been important. We want new parents and kids to sign up. Absolutely, makes sense.
Yeah, precisely that. And so,
and I just want
thinking
to
about it on a service basis is important rather than thinking about the whole thing.
Fantastic. And I want to illustrate, I'm always trying to make this accessible to everybody. So if some of you are dyed-in-the-wool sysadmins and you have technical questions for us, please ask them. Those of you who might be hanging on by your toenails and saying, man, this is complex technical stuff, you can make examples just like that. When your engineers say, yeah, what's the RPO? You can say, what does that mean? And then can you give me an example? And that's exactly the sort of thing that I'm always encouraging non-technical people to do. I even give them certificates that say, you're allowed to ask dumb questions of technical people. We like it. It's a good thing to do. So feel free to do it. We have a question which is not at all dumb, and I want to get to it. And we actually have a few other comments and things which I want to cover. But Roland asks one, and I want to help Roland before he creates a mess. I think Roland's about to drive his company off a cliff here, so I'm worried about Roland. He says, for those of us with dev staging environments, oh, I see what he's doing. Okay, so maybe this will be okay. I didn't read that part. For those of us with dev staging environments, we are looking at turning on the monkeys, those chaos monkeys, the chaos suite that we talked about, in those environments first on game days. I guess that's when he's trying to crash the system and trying to create chaos. Would you recommend recommend or advise against this? What do you think, John?
I mean, I think if you haven't done the tabletop exercise first, all that the monkeys are going to do is show you that everything doesn't work when chaos is added. So I would encourage you to do the sort of design exercise first. As to whether or not turning on the monkeys in your dev and staging environment is a sensible thing to do, broadly depends on how much parity there is between your dev staging environments and your production environment. I think we over the last few years, there's been a movement towards testing in production, essentially, and kind of recognizing and acknowledge that in a complex system under load, the only really representative environment is actually your production environment, and using sort of smart engineering to do that. And do everything in live with feature flagging and stuff is becoming more popular. So staging environments often don't have enough real life stuff going on in them that the monkeys will show you anything necessarily. But certainly if you have a dev and staging environment at all, and you are promoting changes between dev and staging environments and your production environment, then of course, if you're going to be deploying the chaos suite, then you should want to do that in your staging environment. It might be that if you're working under a regulatory framework of some sort, there is a requirement for you to run everything in staging before you take it into production, regardless of what Charity Majors, for example, thinks about the veracity of staging environments. That's certainly a thing that you would want to do first.
Fantastic. Okay, so we just have a few other comments. I just want to get those in. Welcome to everybody who's saying hello. Glad to see all of you. Martin's interested in systems running as expected. We're going to be thinking a lot about systems running not as expected, or trying to make them run not as expected, but we'll cover that, I'm sure. Somebody had another helpful comment. I just want to find it, but I can't find it right now. Oh, Bill was saying he'd love to hear how to use unleashing chaos in government environments. Well, that touches on what you were just saying, John, that you might be required.
Seeing that right now, isn't that?
Well, we have plenty of chaos in the UK government. We have a mess in our UK government, that's for sure. But more seriously, in highly regulated environments, how do you do this kind of robustness testing? What's the state of the art? What are you seeing, John?
Yeah, I mean, sometimes those things are not compatible, right? Ultimately, regulatory frameworks exist in order to theoretically reduce the amount of possible chaos by constraining what you can build. And so a lot of the rules and regulations are about limiting the level of chaos. I suspect that I could make a case for running the Simian army in a regulated live environment based on reading the paperwork and having an argument with an auditor, but I think you would have to argue with an auditor ultimately. I think in a government system, you'd have to argue with the owner of those systems and make sure that that's something that they can get behind. For the majority of my I guess my technical leadership career, I've been involved in organizations that have these kind of slightly more constrained environments, and most of the constraints are hearsay and rumor, or at least they're implemented as hearsay and rumor rather than actually, you know, the thing that's written in the framework. So my technique has always been to go back to the framework and say, you know, all right, if you're saying I can't do this, would you point out which bit of the document you are mostly worried about, you know, exceeding, and then you can have a slightly more nuanced conversation about it. But it has also been my experience that a lot of people sort of stuck in those regulated environments are not really interested in having nuanced conversations.
No, they want to check off yes or no, then make sure that you're compliant. But it's so interesting that when you say that a lot of those constraints are fictitious, I have observed that firsthand in the biotech environment. I would never have expected it with people who are making medical devices. But they were all, exactly as you say, John, they were running in fear from their
CFR 21 Part 11.
Oh, you bet. And medical devices up the wazoo, you wouldn't believe it.
Yep.
And so they were running in fear from this. When we got to the actual compliance people, they were much more flexible. They said, you know what, as long as you're documenting the software process, that's great. And we're glad that you want to release more frequently. We're glad you want to test the system more thoroughly. That's what we want you to do as long as you document it. We got them releasing new versions of the software every 2 weeks, which was revolutionary in biotech. Nobody does that.
It's entirely possible that you can partly thank me for that, because one of our customers was working with an auditor under that framework, who then went on to contribute to or write entirely the latest version of that framework that includes an understanding of things like cloud existing. So you're welcome.
Well, yes, we're very grateful for that, man, and better medical devices, to be sure, because these guys were moving at every 6-month pace, and that was way too slow for sales, not to mention for actual users. So really valuable stuff. Okay, I want to move to a different topic, and I want to start with a story. So this is going to seem unrelated, possibly even to John. He may figure out where I'm going. But I want to tell a story about my neighbor. And I will tie it up, I promise, to robustness and chaos monkeys and everything else. But just bear with me for 2 minutes. My neighbor runs a sheep farm. And the sheep farm has 700 sheep on it, and it's about 50 meters that way. One reason I keep hitting mute is because the sheep come along and they get the dogs barking. And so there's excitement here in very rural Kent. But the key thing that I noticed when I first started moving next to some sheep is that some of them really have personalities. And we have sheepinalities. I'm not sure if that's what you call it. We had one who kept trying to get into our garden. I think like our grass was really exciting. And my wife got to know this sheep. She's really become friends with this sheep. Of course, if you've looked at the calendar, you've noticed that it's kind of around the time when the sheep go away and they don't come back. And this is about to happen to this sheep, we suspect. And my wife's quite broken up about it. The reason I tell the story is because there's a whole philosophy which really helps you to keep your systems robust. And it has to do with making sure your sheep don't have names. So I wonder, John, are you using that kind of technique? Could you explain it to us? What are your thoughts on cattle not pets as its more common name?
Yes, indeed. Yeah. So the cattle not pets thing came about really as a sort of I'm going to say dogma, but without bringing the sort of negative connotations that word necessarily has. A dogma of the configuration management world, probably 10 years ago, something like that, when DevOps was first kind of coming to fruition, and the philosophy there is that everything should be disposable, essentially, right? Don't give your cattle names, because you're going to have to slaughter them ultimately, and you
want to think of the individual components of your architecture, the pieces that are making up the software that you're running, as being completely fungible and replaceable, and you could kill any of them at any time, which is what the monkey might come along and do for you, right?
Yes, that's the principle. And what we sort of get to is a world where we're building immutable artifacts, right? So the things that we deploy into our environments are things that aren't going to be changed once they're deployed. So the reason I use the word dogma, incidentally, is that there are some systems for which that's much less easy than others. Like if you were, it's easier today because today there is almost certainly a managed database service provided by your cloud vendor that does almost all the data storage you would need to do, and so everything that is stateful lives on something that's managed by your cloud vendor on a cloud platform that you're paying for. In the older days, when we were still having to deploy our own Elasticsearch clusters, for example, not everything about your environment was necessarily fungible in that kind of cattle sort of way, and so you would typically have some, if not pets, then at least sheep that you'd given names to. That
the rams that you're going to be breeding the new sheep from.
Absolutely.
To use my neighbor's analogy.
Software like Elasticsearch was actually built in such a way that in theory you could sort of destroy individual nodes in a cluster and have it rebuild, but in practice most people weren't doing that because it's actually quite hard to run these things, which is why it's good to give money to your cloud vendor to do it for you. But in your application landscape, what you're doing then is deploying either machine images or container images that you've built from a recipe. You've taken that image, you've moved it through all of your testing. So maybe you've done your unit testing and your integration testing, you've run some security vulnerability scanning, you've looked at your security supply chain scanning. Like there's a whole plethora of things that you can do with this stuff now on the way to becoming a promotable live artifact. At the point at which you've got that live artifact, that's getting stamped onto your container management system or your instances in your cloud infrastructure, and broadly speaking being left alone, such that if there is a fault, you can go back and you can point at the build process and go, that fault was introduced here. We know where this came from. So I mean, in that regard, we're not even just talking about cattle. We're talking about cloned cattle, where every sheep is identical, a fleet of dollies essentially.
And we can come in and say, wait a minute, the cloning process is wrong here, so we're going to correct that, and then clone ourselves a new flock.
Right. So either something
went
wrong
with
the cloning
means when he
process.
talks about. When John talks about containers, this is the things that you'll hear developers talking about, like Docker and Kubernetes and virtual machines and so on. What those really are is whole computers that you're stamping out the same way we're imagining that you can clone sheep. I don't think we've quite got to, at least my neighbor isn't cloning his sheep. He does them the old-fashioned way with rams and ewes. But someday
I think there are laws about it. There's
think
probably
there
some
are.
kind of sensible reason not to do that.
But in the cloud world, in the software world, we do have it. And
Yep.
so what John's talking about is these mechanisms that allow you to have a kind of perfect sheep. You clone it. You have a perfect server that's set up the way you want it to be. You clone it, and then you deploy it as if it were a whole computer that you had set up very carefully by hand to do all the right things. But you've done it all in your cloning. It's all in the DNA.
Yeah, and I mean, in the old days, what we might have done is sort of manually build a golden image and deploy from that. Today, what we're typically doing is starting from a vanilla operating system or container base, and then automatically adding our things on top of that, our sort of dependencies for application and our application components, and then sort of snapshotting that for use in production. So it's not that we've got a sysadmin who's diligently kind of looking after one pet that's then being cloned into a production environment. It is very much from DNA parts, I suppose. We're starting from there and growing a new.
We're pushing the analogy, but
we are a little bit torturing.
Yeah. Ask us questions if these don't make sense, and ask on the forum if you're watching the recording. But the thing I just want to emphasize is that this is a revolution. Even when you and I were working together at that e-commerce company, this was not standard. It wasn't.
No.
I don't think Docker, if it had been invented, it was very cutting edge. And the idea that you would kind of have this off-the-shelf, kind of already pre-made server that had everything you needed on it, that was new. And so the more common thing was, and certainly what we did, is to set them up by hand, kind of configure them and try to remember how you did it. This has been a revolution which helps us be more reliable. But when your system admins come to you and say, I need to remake the Docker image, that's what they're talking about. They're talking about making sure that they have exactly the right reproducible version of the software, which makes it more reliable. Strangely, we think of software as being this kind of binary 0 and 1 thing, and we always know what state it's in. It's so complex, actually, often we don't, and this helps us control that.
failure modes are very rarely binary in systems these days. I think we in the old, I mean, the three types of disaster you have to worry about in your DR planning are natural disasters, technical failures, and human actions. And natural
the third
disasters,
one is the one that kills me all the time.
Human actions are the ones that get us today. I think technical failures are now much less common than they used to be. Suddenly, kind of maybe 5 or so years before you and I worked together, Squirrel, I think I was working in an ISP that involved we were building servers out of basically PC parts, the things that you'd be buying at home, and so
plugging them together physically and putting them in racks and so on.
Yeah, and
trip over the wires, and
bleeding on them, and
yes.
Sending yourself crazy in data centers, listening to the white noise of the machinery, and those systems were inherently a little unreliable, and so you'd be called out at 3 a.m. to deal with a processor that's fried. Today, the things that we're building are the hardware that's being built for these cloud platforms is, as a baseline, much more reliable. So you see far fewer of these types of faults. But also, when those faults happen, they're someone else's problem, which is the important thing. The natural disasters are still...
Let's be clear, for the financially minded in the audience, people who are CFOs and so on, we're paying more for that, right? I mean, you could buy bare metal and run it yourself. Nobody does it because the operational cost is so high. It's not because the CapEx is high. Because the cost of having it go wrong and be called out at 3 a.m. and your engineers are sleepy the next day and they write a lot of bugs. That's what they're trying to save. Yeah.
And the economies of scale of sort of ordering this stuff, it used to be the case that you'd order servers 6 or 8 weeks before you actually neneeded them, so that you had time to get them in the building. And now you can just turn them on immediately, because again, that's someone else's problem. And at Amazon scale, that's a tractable problem for them to deal with. They own a huge amount of the supply chain, which allows them to keep some of those prices low. But yeah, there's a cost to being in the cloud, but in exchange for that, you get greater agility and much greater reliability and a load of experts running this stuff for you, as opposed to someone like me 20 years ago rolling up to a data center and getting stuck in. You actually got sort of very well run platforms.
But John, here's one of the challenges with these cloud folks. So now I know you're focused on AWS, Google Cloud Platform, Azure. They're very similar. But how do you actually make sure that they're doing the right thing for you? Because they will sell you. They'll show up. They have happy, smiling salespeople who will come and sell you their reserved instances and their fantastic Kubernetes clusters and 50 other things that sound wonderful. My challenge is always, how do I know it's actually working right? It feels like they're marking their own homework. How do you make sure that they're doing the right thing and that you can monitor that you're getting actual value for money and not wasting your hosting costs?
Yeah, so that is broadly true. I think the thing that AWS talk about is the shared responsibility model. So there is a layer of stuff that AWS will take care of for you, and there is a layer of stuff that you have to take care of yourself. So it's not sufficient to just say, I've put this in the cloud, therefore it's reliable. That's a bit of a fallacy. It's definitely going to be more reliable than if you've done it yourself, because, as I said, you running servers yourself is definitely going to be way less competent than Amazon running them for you, but you still have to make certain design decisions to keep stuff highly available and to fit in with the objectives that you've set as far as availability is concerned. And so there's a bunch of things that you have to do, things that you need to consider about reliability, all of which is kind of outlined by well architected or can be you can be guided on by a AWS partner such as the Scale Factory, and ultimately what they're saying is that if you follow these guidelines, we can guarantee that you'll get this level of performance, availability, and security. As far as kind of knowing how true that is, I mean, you can definitely monitor this stuff from the outside if you want to do kind of uptime monitoring and that sort of stuff. That's all doable. The other side of it is, let's say you are working under the HIPAA framework or something in the States, or maybe so
that's the healthcare regulatory framework,
right?
US has,
known typically as the most difficult framework to conform to. So it's a really good
run
benchmark.
in fear. Yeah, HIPAA is coming. Yep.
Exactly. Yeah. So quite tricky. in that in the AWS landscape, there are a number of services that are called HIPAA eligible, which mean that if you use them the right way within your infrastructure, you can build a HIPAA compliant service on that platform. And there's a service called AWS Artifact that if you're an AWS customer, you can just go and log into the console and get at it. And it's a huge documentation repository full of PDFs outlining all of the ways in which the services that you are using conform to those frameworks. So if you are a sort of if you're working in one of those regulated environments and you're working with people who need to be sort of careful about the paperwork, you can provide them all the paperwork they can eat, and that'll send them to sleep for many a night going through it. But
I'm more concerned about operational monitoring, and how do I know that AWS is telling me that I've got this level of robustness, that I'm getting this level of response time in China or wherever it is? How do I know that? And I just want to prompt everybody. We're coming toward the end here, but we got time for questions. So please throw questions in the chat. We're interested in answering things that matter to you. So John, what do we do to keep operational track rather than just regulatory compliance?
So telemetry is really the answer to that question. There's you want to be measuring everything that you care about ultimately. Typically, what we recommend as an AWS partner is that you're using the AWS tools for that monitoring. So Cloudwatch is the internal stuff that AWS provides for monitoring these things, and will generate as much data as you like. And you can keep it for as long as you need to get at that information, and that's everything from kind of how many replicas in my auto scaling group are currently available, how many of them are unhealthy, to what's my time to first byte on my load balancer, to how much RAM am I using in this particular service. Like there are metrics for all of these things. You also need to synthesize those and understand them in some way. You can build dashboards and so forth. There are also third-party tools like Datadog, for example, who can pull out metrics from your cloud platform and represent them in a sort of more meaningful way. There are the two sort of things to consider if you're thinking about this from a kind of executive decision-making perspective. There is real user monitoring and there's synthetic monitoring. So you can, for example, from the outside of your platform, probe API endpoints or pretend to be an application and sort of measure response times and error rates and that sort of thing to kind of test.
Pretend to be somebody on the phone going in and tapping away and getting their results that they're paying for.
Exactly.
And you can actually verify it's happening. Yeah, that's extremely important and helpful.
When you and I first met, Squirrel, we were doing for you at scale. So this was a load test. We had a company come and build out a load test with multiple people pretending to be buyers of this particular handbag on a Tuesday morning, whenever it was, and throw that at the platform and see what happens, get the results out. And there are some places that will do that constantly throughout the day, just to sort of make sure that certainly the flows that you really care about, like can someone check out their basket, for example, like can someone make a payment to Stripe, all that kind of stuff is working fine. On the other side of the coin, what you want to be doing is collecting real user data and synthesizing that into an understanding of how the platform is working at scale. And a good example of this from the SaaS world, which obviously we're very familiar with, we worked with one customer who got us in because their platform they felt was unstable because they were getting complaints from their customers, but they were not really sure why and how it was unstable. And so we started it. We added telemetry to the edge of their network, so that when traffic came in from their users and hit their load balancer, we were getting data from that, as much data as we could from that. And we learned that the unavailability that was being suffered was limited to a percentage of their customers. And these customers all had one particular thing in common. But if they were just looking at aggregate data, they would sort of look at every request and go, well, we've got fewer than 0.5% API failures. That's good. Well, okay, that's good as long as all those 0.5% API failures aren't all hitting this one customer who's having problems. So
and Sod's law says Murphy's law says it's going to be your most powerful, most valuable, important, most visible customer.
always that. So in the SaaS world, we recommend measuring some of these sorts of things on a per tenant basis. so that you have some kind of understanding of how each of your clients is affected by the things that are going on. And that sort of synthetic, AWS call them canaries, which is probably a bad name because that's used for something else somewhere else. But those synthetic tests probably never hit that use case because you're not simulating a user ID that relates to this client that has this particular flag that's turned on that causes this error. So the two things are both valuable for different reasons.
Makes sense. And I'll just note again, questions would be welcome, and there will be a recording afterwards. A couple people have to drop off, so do come back to the recording. But one thing I want to call out there is as far as synthetic testing, when John says check that Stripe is working, check that you're taking payments, he really means it. So what you can do, and Etsy, for example, is famous for doing this, is actually make orders on your site. So Etsy has a room, and it's full of all the wonderful handcrafted goods that their bot has randomly bought once an hour. And they buy them, they just take them all to a charity place. But they buy real knitted teddy bears and gloves and things, whatever it is. They'll buy a real thing with a real credit card that actually gets shipped to them, because they want to verify that you can actually do that. And it's that level of testing and verifying that's really important. I always quote Ronald Reagan, we're going to trust, but we're also going to verify. So we want to actually check that all these services are actually doing what they should, and in a comprehensible way. That's crucial. So if the engineers are just giving you a kind of technical gobbledygook, and they say, oh, and this means it's fine, don't believe them. Make sure they're showing you, here are the actual things we bought in the room. Here is the graph of how our main users are using the system, and here's every one of their requests. That's the level of verification and comprehensibility that you should expect for this kind of monitoring.
I've been that technical guy who's like, here's some gobbledygook, and that means it's fine.
So have I. So have I.
And I, looking back now, recognise how in those moments I was often succumbing to the optimism bias that we're talking about, which is that that thing couldn't possibly have happened. It turns out, yes, it absolutely could.
Makes sense. Sounds good. Well, I'm not seeing more questions, so I'm going to assume that we've stunned you into silence and given you lots to think about. There's lots more discussion, of course, on the Squirrel Squadron forum, so would be happy to see you there, especially if you're watching on the recording. Get in touch there. John, I'm going to put up the Scale Factory website so everybody can see it. Where else can people find you, and how could they get in touch with you?
Yeah, you can. You can find me on LinkedIn. That's the social media that I tend to use the most these days. It's a really good sign that I've properly earned my C title now. Is that instead of wasting time on Twitter, it's LinkedIn instead. The AWS User Group UK meetup group. If you want to check that out, we meet every couple of months to talk about AWS related topics. I also run an event called Breakfast Ops, which is a roundtable discussion forum for CTOs and other technical decision makers. We typically talk about topics like this, actually, and it becomes then a sort of it becomes a peer group discussion / therapy session, depending on the nature of the topic. But we've covered DR, we've talked about security and compliance, we've talked about basically anything that you probably care about as a CTO. The next one of those is going to be beginning of November, I think. We've reduced the frequency of them this year, but if you are interested in joining Breakfast Ops, if you, on that scalefactory.com website, you'll find somewhere in the menu bar there is an events link, and that will let you select Breakfast Ops from there. There's a form to fill out if you'd like to join, and I will add you to the mailing list and keep you apprised if that's the case. You'll also find me on Slacks like CTO Craft, the RANDS Leadership Slack. I am on Twitter. Basically, I'm everywhere. Is the thing that people tend to find. Once they've seen me once, they'll see me a few more times.
John is easily accessible and very friendly and helpful, so I strongly encourage you, as I was encouraging a client just a couple weeks ago, when things are melting, or before they melt is even better, John's a good person to talk to, as we've just observed here.
And, and to get a jump on the before things melt situation, again, if you visit that scalefactory.com website, the top right there's a green button that says free health check. You can book an hour of time with my solutions architect team to have a look at a particular area of interest of your platform. If you are an AWS user, for the most part, we don't really work with GCP or Azure. That's and just an hour of your time. You have an option to focus on backups and DR if that's the thing that is currently on your mind. We can also talk about costs, availability, performance, any of those things. So do get in touch if we can help you assess your current platform risk.
I certainly endorse that, having gotten that kind of service for myself and been really, really benefited from it. Super. Thanks so much, John, for being with us. Thanks to all of you for coming along. Would love more discussion on the forum or elsewhere. Thanks so much, and we'll see you again next week.
Thanks, everyone.